de Robert Marc Friedman. Un poco para introduciros a nuestro ponente, Robert nació en Brooklyn, Nueva York, y ha sido catedrático de la Universidad de California, San Diego, y de la Universidad de Oslo, donde reside actualmente. Ha sido reconocido como Tettelman Fellow en la Universidad de Yale por sus incalculables aportaciones a la comprensión pública de la ciencia. Y bueno, pues como nos contará, pues es el autor de la obra que vamos a representar dentro de este proyecto, recordando a Lise Meitner. Y bueno, pues su ponencia de hoy va a ser sobre Lise Meitner en el escenario. ¿Qué podemos aprender? Pues os dejo ya con Robert. So, Robert, you can start.
Okay. Let me. Gracias y buenas tardes. Lise Meitner devoted her life to physics. She earned a doctorate in Vienna and then moved in 1907 to Berlin. Quietly and firmly, she challenged the barriers against women in science. She teamed up with chemist Otto Hahn, and together they became pioneer contributors to radioactivity. While he soon enjoyed a salaried position, she had no choice but to accept professional marginalization. With the post-1918 creation of the liberal Weimar Republic, she was appointed professor of physics at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. She soon emerged as Germany's leading nuclear physicist, and equally noteworthy, she enjoyed social acceptance among the elite scientists who met regularly at the house of Max Planck. Unfortunately, when Hitler came to power in 1933, her world rapidly changed. Although 2 decades earlier, she renounced her Jewish background and chose to be baptized a Protestant, this mattered little. Under German racial laws, biology became her destiny. In July 1938, friends had to smuggle her into Holland and then arranged for her to move to Sweden. She left behind everything she owned, including her personal laboratory equipment and notebooks. As a 60-year-old refugee, Meitner received a cool reception in Stockholm. Manne Siegban, Sweden's most powerful physicist, provided a room in his new Nobel Institute for Experimental Physics, but little more. It was in Sweden that insult and injury shattered her self-confidence and eroded her reputation. Yet in the months following her forced migration, Meitner played key roles in the discovery of nuclear fission. Let's turn to that part of the story. In 1934, Enrico Fermi in Rome suggested that when uranium atoms are bombarded with neutrons, they emit beta radiation. In the ensuing decay series, uranium transforms into isotopes of new human-made elements beyond the natural endpoint of the periodic table, what they then called so-called transuranic elements. Meitner understood immediately the need to investigate this claim with both chemical analyses and physical theory. She asked Hahn to join her. Let's remember that. She asked Hahn to join her, and then added a talented young analytic chemist, Fritz Strassmann. By 1938, Meitner's team and several other teams of researchers had produced increasingly more complex but puzzling results. Even after she fled Berlin, Meitner continued to participate in the research. As Ruth Syme shows in her excellent 1996 biography of Meitner, Meitner remained secretly in touch with Hahn and provided critical advice. It was Meitner who kept pushing the others to redo crucial experiments. In contrast, Hahn believed, and he wrote this in publications, there was no need for this. The chemical studies showed conclusively the reality of the transuranium elements. There was no need to repeat the difficult chemical analyses. Strassmann noted many years later that it was fortunate that Meitner's judgment, and as leader, carried so much weight. He and Hahn accepted her call in November to repeat several painstaking experiments. It was in this round of analyses that they identified a decay product resembling the much lighter element barium. Preserved correspondence shows that Hahn initially refused to believe barium could be possible. He pleaded with Meitner to provide some explanation. Meitner offered reassurance. Yes, there might yet be some new unknown physical process responsible. She urged him to trust the chemical results. It was first then that Hahn added to a text ready for publication that what had previously been thought to be transuranium elements might actually be forms of elements much lighter than uranium. He and Strassmann offered no explanation that could account for the uranium atoms somehow breaking up to produce barium. They drew no further conclusions. That was Meitner's accomplishment, together with her nephew Otto Frisch, when they met at Christmas. While walking in a snow-covered landscape outside of Gothenburg, they arrived at a model for how the heavy uranium nucleus could split. They made use of an older theory by George Gamow and Niels Bohr that considered the nucleus behaving like a liquid drop. Meitner deduced that a tiny neutron can indeed induce an instability in the massive heavy uranium nucleus and result in the nucleus splitting in two. In contrast to Hahn, she understood the momentous fact that the process releases an enormous amount of energy and highly energized particles. Meitner also was first to recognize that the other fragment must be an isotope of the element krypton. Frisch returned to Niels Bohr's institute in Copenhagen and confirmed their conclusions experimentally. Frisch told Bohr all of this news, who then urged them to publish as quickly as possible. But Bohr visited America and immediately broke his promise to keep his mouth shut until their article was published. Hahn and Strassmann's article was already out. Word of Meitner and Frisch's research spread like wildfire. Once made known, the physical theory behind fission seemed almost intuitively obvious. By the time Meitner and Frisch's article appeared, their work was no longer sensational news. But even more disturbing for Meitner, Hahn began to take all the credit for the discovery. At first, he urged Meitner to publish parallel, so her role would be clear. Then he began to claim that the discovery of fission had nothing to do with physics. He implied that Meitner's great interest in the transuranics had prevented him from making the discovery earlier. He conveniently forgot his own confusion and very limited insights. Meitner could appreciate that Hahn, who was not a member of the Nazi Party, perhaps needed this lie to protect himself and his laboratory. But she feared that her new Swedish colleagues might accept this very version of the discovery. She could not have guessed, what she could not have guessed was that some of them, including Siegbahn, did not want to know what she had actually contributed. Okay, adding insult to injury. turn to Sweden. Manne Siegban never wanted Meitner in his lab. Yet, fate brought him one of Europe's leading nuclear physicists, just when he had decided to build a cyclotron and turn to nuclear physics. It might have worked out favorably for both scientists, but things went quickly from bad to worse. Both Meitner and Siegban were proud, determined, and even stubborn. The relationship suffered from the start, not only from their bad personal chemistry, but also from their strong differences in scientific style. Siegban had risen to a dominant position in Swedish physics as a master of experimental design, or instrumental design, especially in his perfecting of X-ray spectroscopy. Yet he lacked interest and insight into anything outside his own narrow instrument-oriented research. In contrast, Meitner used experiment to help develop theory. Siegban expected members of his staff to conduct their own experiments. Meitner designed hers, but she needed someone to carry them out. Siegban had no assistant, no money to spare. From the start, he considered her a burden. As he wrote to one colleague, "She can do nothing with her hands," unquote. But that was only part of the problem. Having been a Berlin professor, Meitner did not expect to be treated as if she was an inexperienced student. She had to ask permission to use any instruments. She had to ask even for paper clips. She understood quickly that Siegban had no intention of sharing authority or resources with her. Although her command of nuclear physics was vastly superior to his, he was, nevertheless, the boss. Greatly depressed and lacking resources, Meitner was scarcely able to continue with her research. Now, during the war, the neutral Swedish government greatly increased its research budget for defense and for national self-sufficiency. Siegban enthusiastically sought connections between science, industry, and the military. He played key roles on new military research advisory committees and organizations. After the shock of the American atomic bombs, the Swedish government and scientific leadership started to discuss how to exploit Sweden's large, low-grade uranium deposits. Proposals entailed both an atomic bomb to defend the nation's neutrality and nuclear energy to provide cheap power for the Swedish welfare state. A new golden age for nuclear research was dawning. Siegban's time seemingly had arrived. At last, much more money for research than anyone could have dreamed of earlier. Newspapers quoted him, saying that with sufficient funding, he could produce a Swedish atomic bomb in, believe it or not, just a few weeks. Only one fact clouded Siegban's prospects. He was not a nuclear physicist. Other younger Swedish researchers with greater competence wished to break Siegban's monopoly. They regarded Meitner as a valuable asset. After the news of the American atomic bombs, journalists discovered Meitner and converged upon her. A few months later, she visited the United States, where physicists and the media gave her a VIP treatment. She met with President Truman. Prominent scientists believe her contributions certainly deserved recognition with a Nobel Prize. But a prize for Meitner would elevate her from a powerless, despairing, and dependent refugee in Siegban's laboratory into a recognized leading authority in nuclear physics, even in Sweden. Such a scenario made Siegebahn and others uneasy. Actually, by 1946, as I shall now sketch, both Nobel committees had already all but buried Meitner's chances for a prize. Now, let me just give a little background as far as the Nobel Prize is concerned. The Nobel Prize may well be international in scope, but since its beginnings in 1901, the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences had determined the outcome. The entire academy votes on the basis of evaluations and proposals from its respective Nobel committees for physics and chemistry. Each of these 5 member committees prepares an annual report consisting of a brief account of each nominee, a few detailed evaluations of select candidates, and a recommendation to the Academy for how the prize should be allocated. In a culture of respect for authority, the Academy normally accepts the recommendations. But on occasion, quite a few occasions, a rebellion in the Academy can overturn the result. During the first 50 years that I have studied, the Swedish committees relied largely on their own judgment. Committee members' their own comprehension of scientific accomplishment and their own priorities proved critical for the outcome. Some committee members, yes, tried to be dispassionate. Others championed their own disciplinary or personal agendas, sometimes forcefully. When committee members evaluated candidates, their actions were not in a vacuum. At times, these intersected with broader disciplinary interests related to, say, disciplinary boundaries, priorities, methods, and authority. All in all, the list of prize winners and the specialties they represent are by no means inevitable nor unique. Occasionally, committee members confessed in private that more than one candidate equally deserved a prize. At times, they complained over the lack of clear standards for objectively choosing among several deserving nominees. Reward in science, as elsewhere in society, is far from perfect. I will first sketch the chemistry committee's treatment of nuclear fission, and then the same for the physics committee. Theodor Svedberg, inventor of the ultracentrifuge and one of Sweden's most prominent scientists, had for many years sought to legitimize nuclear research as belonging not just to physics, but also to chemistry. His interest in fission was immediate. He proposed both Hahn and Meitner for the 1939 Chemistry Prize. This would allow him an opportunity to study the new findings in detail. Svedberg's report first notes that all prior research on the alleged transuranic elements is erroneous. He then cut Meitner out of any role having to do with fission, claiming that Hahn had the discovery after their collaboration had ended. He suggested that Hahn could finally make the discovery of fission once Meitner had left. That sounds familiar. We should note that Hahn visited Stockholm in the spring of 1939 and may well have been the source of this lie. Svedberg also claimed that Niels Bohr was the one who was responsible for the theory of nuclear fission. He concluded that Hahn alone should receive a prize, but recommended the committee wait as much new research on fission still needed to be assessed. When Svedberg again evaluated Hahn and Meitner in 1941, after a Dutch chemist nominated the two, he emphasized that fission entails a chemical discovery. Its significance was for nuclear chemistry. Svedberg noted that while in the past 2 years, Hahn continued to publish excellent work, Meitner had not produced anything of significance. He neglected to say why her research had come to a stop. But the message was clear. How could she possibly have played a role in this momentous discovery? Svedberg had spoken. His colleagues now knew. Arne Vestgren, a close ally of Svedberg, joined the committee in 1942. He had previously nominated just Hahn, and in 1942, he again nominated just Hahn. Another committee member, senior committee member, Wilhelm Palmer, however, expressed concern over the committee's one-sidedness. Palmer nominated Hahn and Meitner and promised to deliver a fairer evaluation. But before he could write this report, he died. Instead, Vestgren evaluated the two, even though he had already revealed his belief that only Hahn deserved recognition. So here's the point. He nominated just Hahn, but then the committee says, no, evaluate both of them, even though he made it clear who he actually wanted. So if this sounds like the start of a less than objective evaluation, you are right. Vestgren largely repeated Svedberg's negative comments about Meitner's work, but now much more categorically. The committee voted that Hahn should receive an undivided prize, but because of the international tensions, if there is a world war going on, it recommended reserving the prize. When Vestgren repeated his nomination and the evaluation in 1945, the committee proposed in a preliminary vote in June to award a prize to Hahn. When the Pacific War ended in August 1945, it soon became clear that massive amounts of research related to nuclear fission had been kept secret. In September, the committee changed its proposal. It now recommended a postponement until it could study whether others deserved to share the prize with Hahn. This specifically did not mean Meitner. She was eliminated. And there's pencil writings on the drafts and crossing out her name and saying, no, no Meitner. When the Academy debated the prizes in November, a member of the section for medicine, Göran Lillestrand, insisted that Hahn should not wait. He must receive a prize now. The Academy had to show the world that the neutral Swedes can award a prize to whomever they choose, even to a German, which would displease the Americans. Now, this odd reasoning resulted in the Academy overturning a unanimous chemistry committee's recommendation to wait. This could only happen if he had support from other powerful members of the Academy, such as Siegbaum. A prize for the discovery of fission to Hahn would close the issue of whether Meitner should share in this recognition. That's what they no doubt thought, but that is not exactly what happened. So let's turn to the Physics Committee. Up until this point, the Physics Committee had simply refused to evaluate fission. Even though prominent physicists such as Arthur Compton, James Franck, and Samuel Gutschmidt had proposed a division of the prize between Meitner and Hahn, the committee washed its hands of fission. Franck repeatedly called attention to the fact that Hahn and Strassmann's article only hinted at fission. Meitner and Frisch were the first to identify and confirm the process. The committee ignored this. It also ignored Franck and others' assertion that fission was the most important discovery for over a decade in physics and for physics. Instead, the committee declared that fission belonged to chemistry and declined to evaluate, even though Meitner was nominated not for chemistry at that point, but for a physics prize. Moreover, the physics committee knew very well that the chemists had repeatedly declared that they had no intention of recognizing Meitner. And just to make clear his opinion, Siegban, who very rarely used his rights to submit nominations, did send one in 1943, stating that a prize for fission should go undivided to Otto Hahn. Finally, a showdown of sorts was in the making after Hahn received the chemistry prize in 1945. Several senior laureates proposed Meitner for the 1946 physics prize. These included Bohr, Compton, Frank, Max von Laue, and Max Planck. Bohr, in his letter, described details of what happened behind the scenes in why, when he said why Meitner deserved recognition. The physics committee can no longer refuse to evaluate fission as part of physics. Siegban, he didn't do the evaluation himself. As he often did, he let others do his dirty work. In this instance, the committee assigned the task of writing a detailed report on fission to Erik Hultén, a professor of experimental physics at Stockholm University. Hultén was loyal to Siegban, but also had his own agenda. His Stockholm colleague, theoretical physicist Oskar Klein, was planning to establish a department for nuclear physics at the university. Part of this plan was to include leading roles for Meitner as well as possibly Frisch. Klein had nominated Meitner and Frisch for a physics prize in 1945 and now again in 1946. Hultén opposed Klein's plan. He did not want Meitner as a colleague. He also made an agreement with Siegban that he would oppose any effort to establish a competing center for nuclear physics at his university. Even if Hultén succeeded, they both knew that several other initiatives were being discussed to break Siegban's monopoly, and these plans included roles for Meitner. So there's a lot more going on when they're evaluating for the prize than just thinking of the prize in isolation. Hultén's report is one of the most error-filled and biased evaluations in the first 50 years of awarding Nobel Prizes, and I've studied them all. Had a student submitted this evaluation to me as a seminar paper, I would have to give it a D-, and that's only because I'm a nice guy and I don't like to fail students. Hultén continued to advance the myth that Bohr had discovered the physical process of fission, even though Bohr showed in his own letter of nomination that this honor belongs to Meitner. Hultén depicts Meitner as being almost alone in believing in the existence of the pre-1939 transuranic elements. This was self-serving. Hultén was responsible for the embarrassing fact that Fermi received the 1938 Nobel Physics Prize in part for discovering these very same transuranic elements. Hultén had written that evaluation and recommended that. Now Hultén left Meitner holding the bag of so-called erroneous science. Hultén dismissed all the details provided in several letters of nomination that describe Meitner's actual role in the discovery. He insisted on the need to evaluate based only on the published record. But he knew very well that this record was misleading due to the extraordinary circumstances. Similarly, even though nominators explained why the discovery of fission was a consequence of Meitner's research program, Hultén insisted, as had Svedberg and Veskring, that Hahn's discovery was the start of an entirely new research endeavor having nothing to do with the earlier project. He declared Meitner not worthy of a prize. Hahn came to Stockholm in 1946 to receive his prize. Although he had to keep his contact with Meitner secret all during the war, he continued to tell the same story to journalists and others even after Hitler's defeat. Did he actually forget his own confusion in December of 1938, his pleading for guidance from Meitner? Or had he decided that lies that served him well earlier can still be useful? Meitner continued to be marginalized in Sweden, although years later she received prestigious prizes abroad. Her fate as a researcher was first crushed by Nazi hatred and then sealed by Swedish insensitivity and self-interest. She eventually moved to Cambridge, where Frisch was working, and died there in 1968. In conclusion, Meitner's tale is one that asks us to consider that science perhaps loses out by a single-minded focus on competition and prizes. The reasons for the cult of the Nobel Prizes are many, but the reality of the prizes never matched the hype. The golden Nobel medallions are etched with human frailties. For Meitner, the Nobel scandal was not as great a disappointment as the loss of what really mattered to her. Meitner's love of physics was paramount. For Meitner, the great attraction of science included the possibility of belonging to a community in which friendship and collegial respect went hand in hand with the search for new knowledge. As the age of big science and extreme competition for authority, prestige, and large grants began in earnest, she lost much more than merely a prize. Muchas gracias for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert, for the conference, for this telling us this unfair story for Lise Meitner. So now we have some time for questions. So, is there any question here in the room? Anabel?
La voy a decir en español y la traduces tú, ¿de acuerdo?
Vale.
Sí, para que te oiga él.
Pero igual no te oirán.
La tienes que repetir tú en inglés para que traduzca Carla, ¿de acuerdo? Pregúntale a Robert si cree que de haber sido hombre Meitner hubiera tenido los mismos problemas con el comité de los Nobel.
Vale. So Robert, is here Annabelle in the audience? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so Annabelle is asking if you think that if Meitner, she was a man, if you think that she would have the same problems with the Nobel Committee as she had for being a woman.
I think she would not have had the same problems. Correct. No, there's no problem. Yes, she would. It would have been a different story. Yes. The you might say no. There's no. It's hard to differentiate. To see different, how much is it that she's a woman? How much is it that they considered her to be Jewish, even though she formally had converted? How much just being an outsider? But there's no question that I've heard from others who knew Sigmund. He did not like the idea of a little old lady who knew more physics than he coming in to his laboratory and expecting that she should share in the resources that he had worked so hard to get hold of over many years. So yeah, and the same thing with Otto Hahn's behavior. I think it's easier for them to feel they can get away with doing things like that because she was an anomaly. You know, they just were not used to having somebody who's a woman to be on top intellectually. Period.
Yeah. Okay. So is there any other question from the audience? Berta? Do you want to ask in English or maybe here?
Lo pregunto en español también y
Okay,
lo traduzco
okay.
esto al inglés. Me gustaría saber si sabemos algo de cómo fue su vida después de estos acontecimientos. Está claro que ella fue ninguneada, pero vivió bastantes años más. Hay fotos en las que se ve a ella discutiendo con estudiantes, con Otto. ¿Sabemos algo de lo que pasó?
Yeah, Robert, so Berta is asking
Yes.
if you know, if we know, how was her life after all this episode? I mean, because we have seen many pictures of her with the students, and we know she
Yes.
continued working. How was her life?
Well, she picked herself up and continued. She became very active in international organizations. You know, she traveled around encouraging young women to to think about physics. You know, that physics, you know, was her great love, and she wanted to express that to other young women. But you know, again, she was active on many different international commissions. You know, she was part of the 1950s anti-atomic bomb movements, but she wasn't that active as a researcher anymore. That's, you know, was sort of what was broken. So, you know, she's a very strong, determined woman. You know, she was depressed over many things at the end of the war and the mid 1940s. You know, the fact that she saw that Otto Hahn, and many of her earlier German colleagues refused to understand their moral weaknesses during the war. You know, Hahn would go around complaining that the Allied occupation of Germany was much worse than anything Germany had done. You know, and she just couldn't believe, you know, in Poland or elsewhere, she just couldn't believe things like that. But after a period, the Nobel Prize, you know, she, as in the play that I hope most of you will get to see in a few days, you know, that is not the thing that disturbs her most. As I say at the end of this talk, she was more disturbed that spirit of working together, of helping one another, of not being in such direct competition, that was being lost with the militarization of physics, shall we say, the growth of big science, the you know, the big men who want to do their big things with the big projects, and that changes the style and the physics as a way of life that had first attracted her.
Okay, thank you. So we have another question here in the chat. So Josep, that was a speaker before, so he's thanking you for the talk, and he's asking, what about Meitner's circulation across several national?
I didn't catch that last. What about Meitner's? Oops, I just another woman who I'm trying to find the question. I only saw it for a second. Was it to another woman who? Well, Rosalind Franklin number was passed over. It's also, let me point out that in terms of the politics of excellence, that how people get prizes or not get prizes, there's also, oh, you can't hear me? Can you hear me? Okay. Madame Curie, Marie Curie's prize in chemistry is, Annabelle is saying we can't hear you. Is that in the other room or? We cannot hear Miriam, but we can hear, okay, well, let me just try that. Curie's so-called second prize in chemistry came about through actually a political maneuver by Svante Arrhenius. She was hardly nominated. He maneuvered the chemistry committee. So even though we might applaud that prize, it was still also a result of more of manipulation and politics. I see we have a problem here. Maybe I should just. Okay. Well, as far as the Nobel Prize and women, the main problem historically, is basically that women have been denied the possibility of getting first-class training, access to resources and positions that could lead to what you, I guess, could call Nobel quality research. So there generally was not that many women who early had achieved such prominence. Annabelle is saying that they've lost the connection.
Yeah, we recovered the sound now. Can you hear us?
Okay. But I mean, because and also what motivates people to nominate the ones that they propose, and well, in more recent times, I think probably the Swedish committees would desperately want to find somebody. Many of the committee members, I can only assume, it would be very popular to give prizes in chemistry or physics to women. So I think they would be very eager if there are women nominated who are in that general level of excellence that they would consider. But I think the problem of discrimination against women and others, also social class, ethnicity, etc., made it more difficult for women to be in a position to do the kind of research that somebody such as Meitner managed to achieve. I think Dorothy Crawford in chemistry, she waited quite a bit. I've seen some correspondence that there was at first some committee members were making excuses why they had to wait, but finally she, of course, did get the prize. It's sometime in the 60s, if I recall. But anyway, maybe other questions?
Yes.
Yeah.
So,
so there is one question here in the audience.
Yes, my name is Raquel. I wanted to ask, to think like the situation of Lise Meitner, it was like very particular situation, or there are actually many hidden Lise Meitner, and if you think that nowadays in the 21st century, if you think if this could happen, or the situation has improved a lot. So what is your opinion?
I think it's much less likely, and but I'm sure in many countries there's still plenty of discrimination. I think it's the fight for equal access and equal respect in the sciences is still a battle that is not completely finished. But I don't think such a ugly and despicable case as what happened to Meitner is as likely now. There are also many universities have committees that are able to file charges. It's expected that to be more open and including than in the past. So I think the situation, you probably, all of you know better than I, but I think the situation is much, much better. But we also have to recall it was only recently that,
so I was
for
referring
example,
to the Nobel Committee, to the...
Yeah. So Raquel says that she was talking about the Nobel Committee. Yeah.
Yeah, in present and past. Whether in the present it is the same situation or we have improved.
I think that I don't know the people sitting on the committees at present, so I can't say. But I suspect they are much more open. The few committee members who I have known in past years, some of them are. In fact, there was the person who encouraged me to write the play about Meitner, a professor of physics in Gothenburg. He became chairman of the committee for a couple of years. But there are also on the committees even now, who defend Siegbahn, who think when the play that you're going to see on Thursday and this weekend was first performed in Gothenburg, the secretary of the physics committee, the president, said that, at that time they didn't divide prizes. That's why she couldn't get it, which is pure nonsense. And then another committee member and disciple of Siegbahn, he said, well, I like the play, but it's full of lies. And it's a campaign by feminists and Zionists to hurt the reputation of Siegbahn and the prize. So which is wonderful to hear, because the audience realized what sort of narrow-minded, bigoted, prejudiced fool this man was. So there are still arrogant people who will still believe, that maybe women are best, don't work, they can't work as hard, or there's all sorts of stupid, excuses to believe that women cannot do as well or even better than men. But by and large, we've come a long, long way since what happened to Meitner.
Okay, so there are a couple of interesting questions in the chat. I don't know if, while we were without sound, perhaps you replied. I don't know if you replied to Olga Mena, maybe not, because Olga was asking if you had to focus on another highly determined and successful and ignored woman scientist, which one would you choose?
Well, there's what's her name? No, I can't think offhand. at the moment. I'm sorry. I still have more work to do with Meitner. I think I want to write a screenplay for an animation film and about Meitner that will cover the period from about 1933 till the end of the 40s. And I think there's also and explore much more, going into detail, the question of identity. What did it mean for her to, her identity as a woman, as a Jew who converted, but then is still subject to persecution, and just how did she manage to make her way, like somebody like Max Planck, who helped her in those early years in Berlin. He normally would say that a woman is best in the kitchen. He was not in favor of women entering physics, but he just saw that Meitner was so intelligent and so maybe non-threatening or whatever it is, but he was willing to help her, even though the rules and laws said that she cannot have an academic position. So I think there's still much more to, well, in fact, yes, now I know the other woman who interests me was a Swedish physicist by the name of Eva von Bahr-Bergius. This is the woman friend of Meitner who she visited at Christmas in '38 when she and Frisch made the walk in the snow and the discovery. This woman comes from an aristocratic family. That she chose to study physics was considered a disgrace for the family. She was probably the best experimental physicist before World War I in Sweden, or one of the very best, but she just internalized the prejudices, and would always say, oh, I'm not really good enough. I'll just be a secondary school teacher. And her life after that becomes very, very interesting. So she's somebody who, her relationship with Meitner, because the two of them were going to be pioneers, break barriers, and then Eva withdraws and becomes just a school teacher after collaborating with Frank and Hertz in many of the critical experiments that they did and later got the Nobel Prize for. So yeah, there are women out there. I think many women who, just like this Eva von Bahr, first rate, but they just disappeared. So it's hard to know that they're out there to study them. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, very interesting. So then maybe the last one. So Professor Bertomeu is asking that, given your experience on this subject, if you could offer an overview of the politics behind the committee's decisions in the years of Meitner, and if you think that were disciplinary interests the main issues behind the decisions. Other issues were more important.
Yes, I think it's all wrapped up. I think there's no question there is a will, there is a desire to prevent Meitner from sharing in the prize. They do not want that, because it's not a question of that they didn't realize or they didn't know, that it's possible in 39, Svedberg thought, okay, well, Meitner left Berlin, so of course Hahn must have done this by himself. But by 1946, in the letters of nomination, from Bohr especially, and Oscar Klein, it was all spelled out, and that they still refuse even to entertain the possibility. Well, let's put it this way: they broke from their own usual procedures of how they treat candidates. There are a number of procedural things that just does not make sense, which adds to the evidence, shall we say, that they were not going to let her share this prize. And it's hard to know what some of the other members may have thought, but because don't forget, even though you have 5 members on the physics committee, 5 members on the chemistry committee, not all members are equal. Some are more powerful, some have greater authority, and dominate. But yeah, I think there's a bit of nationalism here. It's funny. Left-wing people in Sweden considered her German, so they didn't like her because she was German. Others didn't like her because they thought she was Jewish. Others just didn't like her because she was a woman trying to be a big shot scientist. But the committee, it's what's just as troubling that the committees really were not fair and turned evidence away. But at the present, they still will the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences and the Nobel establishment accept and say, yes, this was wrong, and we acknowledge that now. Instead, just as with the case of Einstein and the refusal to reward relativity theory, they make all sorts of excuses up rather than admitting that there was prejudice on the committee and in the academy. And that's why history is important, because when we realize that these things do happen, we can face them instead of making believe that, such as the Nobel procedures, that everything is objective, impartial. They somehow try to find the best without any other interests involved. That's nonsense. And the fact that prejudice, again, because of social class, because of ethnicity, of religion, nationality, gender, these things have affected science in the past, and there's still battles to be won today to make sure that this kind of bias is stamped out. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have finished. Thanks a lot for your talk. It was very, very interesting. We are looking forward to the theater.
Yes, it'll be a lot more fun than listening to me, and will be much more emotional.
Yeah, it's a pity that you cannot be here with us.
Okay. I wish so much to be there. I hope maybe we can do this another time with a different theme. I appreciate the opportunity to sharing the play and my work with you. I thank you all very, very much, and I hope maybe next time I'll be able to speak at least a little bit more Spanish than at present.
Okay, thank you very much, Robert, and yeah,
you.
see you next time.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.